So first of all, Paul, thank you so much for the very kind invitation to join you for the conference this year. I would love for me to in-person meeting since I'm new to Ireland. As you can hear, I'm from the United States, and I look forward to meeting you next year. The topic of my talk tonight is going to be promoting team inclusiveness in simulation-based education. And I'm imagining you might have many thoughts about what team inclusiveness is. Of course, I'm going to explain that as we go along. And just to keep your interest, I do have a handout, which I will be sharing at the end of the talk via a QRS code. So on the last slide, there will be a code to get you the handout. I have a number of disclosures, which you can see here, and I'll just give you a second to review them. All right. So the aims of the next about 25 minutes or so are for you to be able to outline how team communication helps or hinders not only patient care, but also learning, to explain the potential for team inclusiveness to promote learning and performance, and then finally for you to apply principles of team inclusiveness into your simulation-based education, whether you work with undergraduate students in medicine, nursing, other allied health or social professions, and also postgraduate training. So when we think about the work that we do in healthcare, very often we focus on the task work, which is what we need to do to care for patients in terms of medical management, prescribing, procedures, all of these things. And of course, the task work is something that needs to happen, and the teamwork is how that happens. And I will say very often I hear, although increasingly less so, that this teamwork and communications are more of a soft skill. And I hope that my talk will just add another brick to that wall, that teamwork is an essential component and there's nothing soft about it. And indeed, it is this integration of task work and teamwork that is absolutely required for safe, effective patient care in modern healthcare settings. So what I'd like to do is focus our attention on team communication, which, as we've heard from many people already today who focus on human factors, we realize this is an important aspect. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to perhaps give a bit of a different spin on team communication and highlight that not only is team communication important for getting the task work done and to work together, but it's also an important driver of how we learn, both in simulation and also through our workplace practice. And one of the tenets of course, interprofessional education and learning is that we learn with, from, and about each other. And I think this is a vitally important aspect of our clinical practice. It's been amply documented that when communication breaks down, patient care breaks down. And what I'd like to submit to you today is that not only does patient care break down, but learning breaks down. And this is really was the whole thesis of a book chapter that I wrote several years ago. We think when we don't communicate, it may impact patient care, which is true, but actually, especially for those of us who are in teaching teams, it breaks down the learning as well. So when we look at this image, we see a group of young children who look most excited to share what's on their mind, to ask a question. I don't think any of them look worried whether or not they are right or wrong. They want to voice out. And yet we know that in many domains, especially in healthcare, this desire to give voice to concerns is beaten out of us in many ways. And we learn to remain silent unless we're absolutely sure of what we're going to say. And of course, safe patient care relies on people speaking up. And not only does patient care require us to speak up, but our learning requires us to speak up. A couple of years back, I spent some time thinking more deeply about speaking up, and I'm not a speaking up expert, but in this article, I reviewed the literature, and it was quite interesting to me. It was when we look at communication breakdowns, speaking up is actually one of those communication breakdowns that occurs in our full awareness. We are actively choosing voice, which is to speak up, over silence. And it is one of those things we are aware of it. And for those of you who, whether you have a clinical background or whether you are in a workplace where you might choose to just remain silent even though you have a concern. You know what I'm talking about. And I think there are a number of things quite pernicious in healthcare itself, such as disruptive behavior that we may be observing or that we experience when people raise their voice. They are inappropriate, and somehow, at least this was the case for me in the United States, it may be different here in Ireland, this type of behavior is allowed to continue. The other thing that we know is that witnessing rudeness impacts our ability to think, our cognitive capacity. And Rona Flynn, who I know you worked very well closely with, Paul, up in Aberdeen, has lovely papers on this in the BMJ about the negative impacts of even witnessing rude behavior. And I think one of them is also just learning to keep your mouth shut. And then, of course, this ever-present pimping, especially for physicians on the ward round, where you're asked rapid-fire questions until you come to the limits of your knowledge to expose your learning edge, so to speak. But these things all socialize us to want to be sure before we speak. And in order to speak up, we require psychological safety. And Michael mentioned psychological safety in his talk. And Amy Edmondson, whose work I also admire, defines psychological safety as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And it is a space in which interpersonal risk-taking is possible. So it could be that being uncomfortable with an idea or with uncertainty requires us to embrace that discomfort and voice out or speak up, which is risky, to say I made a mistake or I don't know. Paul, you mentioned in your, after Michael's presentation, how you were treated after your simulations in the Navy and how you were sort of beat down, so to speak. And I think this is a classic example of how we learn to be silent. So psychological safety, which is required in simulation, and I think Jenny Rudolph, Michaela Kolbe, and others, including myself, have written on this topic. It is not only a word that we imbue at the beginning of a simulation session or a training day. It is a feeling that learners must have within them in order to take the risks that is required in simulation and also in clinical practice. Now, I know that as it relates to speaking up, many of you may be involved in teaching SBAR, which is situation, background, assessment, and recommendation. And I'm all for SBAR. However, SBAR is not enough. SBAR is not enough. And it's not enough because it's not only a matter of speaking up, it's a matter of listening up. And I think that is one of the areas that where we have a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping in a moment to share some potential solutions and how we can perhaps bring some of these ideas into our simulation-based education. So the argument I'm making today is that how we talk to each other matters, not only to promote safe and effective patient care, but also to create a culture of learning there wherever we are working. So as Paul mentioned, I have a clinical background in pediatric emergency medicine and was very often confronted with my team with a child who was life-threateningly ill. Much as in this situation, this child, and it is actually a simulator, this child requires ventilatory support. This child may have shock. This child requires many interventions in order to survive. And yet, as many of you will know, it is not our goal that our patients survive. It is our goal that our patients achieve their full potential. And this was one of my utmost missions as a practicing pediatric emergency doctor, that my children would ultimately walk out of the hospital or continue their life's trajectory. So this is what this is all about. Now, unfortunately, speaking up is prevented in many ways because of the group processes that we see. And in particular, this paper about social identity theory that Brian Buford wrote several years back. And this is all about how we come to belong to certain groups or become a member of a group. And so when we think about it, there is the in-group or the cool kids. For example, I used to work in the emergency department. In the ED, we were the cool kids in the ED and everyone else was not cool. The ICU was somehow the others, the out group. You could also imagine there are professional in-groups. We are the doctors, they are the nurses. We are the ED doctors, they are the surgeons. This is just a very natural process, but the problem with this is it develops group boundaries, and it is difficult to communicate across group boundaries. There's a higher threshold, including a higher threshold to speak up. Jenny Weller, who's an anesthetist in Auckland, New Zealand, talked very eloquently in this piece about tribalism. And it is, again, this sense of belonging to specific group or tribes. And really the gist of this is that this promotes an us versus them mentality. Us versus them. And one of the things that's vital within this whole thing, if you're in the in group, the us group, so to speak, we are motivated. Our attributes are somehow more than those in the other group, the out group or them, the royal they that we are all familiar with. They're somehow less than, not as motivated. So this is a problem. Here's a lovely paper from Renee Stallmeyer that came out about a year ago, where Renee and Laura talk about challenging the continued siloed education and how we continue to foster physicians training physicians and nurses training nurses. And in these hot siloed approaches, which is the distillation of this Cherokee proverb, which is about a wolf. There's an elder and a young boy who are talking about life. And the elder says, "Within me, there are two wolves, one who is good, the other who is evil," etc. And the boy says, "Well, grandfather, who wins?" And the elder says, "The wolf you feed." And unfortunately, the wolf that we've continued to feed in medical education is an intra-professional approach. That means doctors are teaching doctors and nurses are teaching nurses. Emergency doctors are teaching emergency doctors, surgeons are teaching surgical doctors. So there are continued silos. Marie Morris, who's one of my colleagues here at RCSI, who is a critical care nurse and PhD educator, she and I were so enamored with Renee Stallmeyer's piece that we actually wrote a commentary, and we made an argument for changing how we think about educational norms by thinking about collaborative intentionality, which is thinking deliberately about those moments in which we must work together. An example would be on a multidisciplinary ward round, which hopefully is multidisciplinary, versus some specialties who may still view the ward round as being a uni-professional activity. And this is all about being intentional about how we work together. And what I'd like to do now is give you one example of the ideas we presented here, and that is looking into the future and thinking about team inclusiveness, which is one of the major ideas of this talk. So how do we put our hands together and how do we work better together? And up until this point, I've given some background and outlined the problem. And what I'd like to do now is present some solutions, in part based on my own research program. And I would like to say that I will share practical strategies that you can implement tomorrow in your educational practice and in your workplace activities. So this is a piece we wrote a couple years back about shifting from us to them to us through team inclusiveness. And I know that in the current landscape, EDI or equity, diversity, inclusion is a big topic. And what we're talking about here with team inclusiveness is not inclusiveness of diversity of cultural background, for example, but diversity of professional background, diversity of training level, the type of diversity that we see in the healthcare settings in which we're training our learners to engage when they leave our simulation centers. So when we think about what it takes to put the pieces together to be inclusive in a team context, there are three main ideas I'd like to raise with you. The first is inclusive leadership. The second is inclusive leader language, and the third is team reflection. The first, inclusive leadership, was first published by Nembhard and Edmondson in 2006. And inclusive leadership is really quite simply inviting and appreciating others' contributions. That means it's not waiting for them to speak up, it's inviting them to speak up. This is where ASPAR is not enough. I need to invite people to speak up, which can be uncomfortable, and I need to appreciate their contributions. Now, in this particular study, the authors empirically showed that this type of leadership increases voice behavior or speaking up behaviors. That means people speak up more when leaders engage in this type of approach. A related concept is inclusive leader language. Mona Weiss, Michaela Kolbe, and others from Zurich did this elegant simulation study in which they manipulated how leaders invited either out-group members or in-group members to participate. And for out-group members, for example, physicians inviting nurses explicitly by name, for example, to contribute, or using inclusive language for in-group members, as in with other physicians, that these behaviors promoted speaking up. And again, what I'm arguing is speaking up behaviors not only promote patient safety, but also promote learning. And so when we think about this implicit language, we, us, our, that means rather than saying, Paul, what is your plan? Paul, what do you want to do? It's, Paul, what are we going to do about this? What is our next step? And this may sound quite simple, and you might be thinking, Walter, this is antics with semantics. And I would encourage you to have a look at this paper because it's a very elegant study that shows that this language matters. And then finally, a large component of my recent research program with a work and organizational psychologist from Switzerland called Jan Schmutz, we have done a lot of writing on team reflection. And I'm going to explain a little bit more what team reflection is now. If we look here at the schematic, you see that there is a patient on a stretcher. The patient is in the center, and this is, so to speak, the patient care episode. And then there's a before, the during the patient care episode, and after the patient care episode. And when we think about team reflection or team reflexivity, very classically, the team reflexivity literature looked at the type of team reflection that occurred after an event, which when Jan first told me about it, I'm like, that sounds like a debriefing. And many of you may know that healthcare debriefing is one of my big academic passions. What Jan and I did, though, is we looked at the reflective processes that comprise team reflection, and we thought, not only can you be engaging in team reflection after a patient care episode, but also before it in the form of a huddle or briefing, as well as during. And we call these pre-action, so before the action team reflection, in action, or during the action team reflection, as well as post-action TR. And some of you may know about the principle of a 10-4-10, which is a paper that Marcus Rahl and Rona Flynn and other, I believe Ron Gavin published several years back, where you take 10 seconds for 10 minutes during the case to recap, summarize, so that you have some more organized working. The goal of all three of these reflective moments, if you will, is to create a shared mental model to promote adaptation, which in many ways is learning. So team reflection is nothing more than a team's collective ability to reflect on goals, processes, strategies, and outcomes to get better. So let's take a closer look at in-action team reflection and the type of recapping, summarizing, inviting input, and planning that many of you may already be emphasizing is really the key behavior. And the focus is on two aspects. The first of which is how people recap and summarize, and when they do that in the course of an event, patient care event. This may look like, hey, let's review what we've done so far, or let's recap to make sure we're on the same page. This could be something that is leader initiated, or it could be someone on the team who's triggering this recap. Hey, can we review what we've done so far? Or can we get a recap, please? And I'm sure as many of you know, people around a patient, whether it's in simulation or in the clinical environment, may not all have the same mental model or about what is going on. Now, critically important is this inviting input that is really part of the inclusive leadership I mentioned earlier. And this may look like this. So what do you think? What are we missing in terms of what could be going on, or in terms of what we'd like to do? What else could be going on? Are there other ideas or suggestions? So let's take for a moment an example of a patient who's critically ill, who has a low oxygen level, who has been intubated, and we've worked through all of the different sort of algorithms that could contribute to our understanding about why this patient's oxygen level is low. Let's say 85% or 80%. And now we think, okay, we've worked through dopes as an example. What else could we be missing? Patient's hypoxia, we've checked all the different things. We've worked through the algorithm. What could we be missing? This is an example of inviting input. So we did a simulation-based study that we published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior. And we looked at specifically these behaviors in 70 simulated pediatric emergencies. And we showed that teams who engage in these specific in-action reflective moments, which can be very brief, demonstrated improved clinical performance based on assessment of checklists, especially in larger teams. So when teams had 8, 9 people, this was especially a vitally important thing to make sure people were on the same page and sort of all pulling on the same oar, so to speak, in the same direction. Last year, we published this tool to measure team reflection even better. We call this Turbo, and this focuses on the information processing mechanisms, such as seeking information, evaluating that information, and then also making sense of it and planning next steps. So we're able to actually measure team reflection. Now, of course, I want to say one of the things we'd like to do is continue to do studies here, because it's unclear if this is one of those things where the more the better, because you can't be reflecting all the time, because you also need to be doing the task work of caring for patients. So I would encourage you to maybe have a look at this and think about how you can encourage your teams to pick the right moments and debrief these moments about reflecting and seeking input from the team. One of the things I'm currently working on is a study that is focused specifically on these pre-action team reflection moments. So we're doing a study in pediatric critical care and emergency medicine using scenarios where a child is about to arrive. They're 8 minutes out with an ambulance, for example, and the team needs to prepare. So 5-year-old child who was in a motor vehicle crash, who's now being ventilated by the paramedics, is on their way in. The GCS is 6, and they will be here in 6 minutes. Get ready. So the team organizes. Now, this is the type of simulation scenarios that we actually do quite infrequently. And I think we can do a lot more of this kind of work in our simulation center. So Jan, Michaela, and I wrote a lovely paper about integrating these ideas into your simulation-based team training. And we break them up between things you can do that focus on reflecting before, things you can do to promote reflection during, and how you can integrate these notions into your debriefings. I'll also point out that Eve Purdy, who's an emergency physician from Australia, as well as Vic Brazel, have a lovely paper that came out, I believe it was last year or 2 years ago, where they focused on doing in situ trauma simulations that only focused on these pre-arrival. And they talked about promoting relational coordination through these principles. So there's other evidence that really highlights the importance of these reflective moments, or the 0-point survey that was touched on earlier, making sure people are ready beforehand. As we touch on team reflection, and which is a team debriefing, I'd just like to highlight this particular piece that is not as related to team inclusiveness, but I'm just highlighting here because this is a simulation audience. And I know that very often simulationists are invited to debrief perhaps clinical events in the hospital, for which you may be well suited if the intention is to promote learning, because we as simulation educators are all about exploring an experience, an event, for the benefit of learning. And what we write about here is that some team debriefings, though, have the intention to treat or have a therapeutic intention. And I would say I view myself as an educationalist, not a therapist. And what we do is we disentangle this perhaps murky overlap between team debriefings. And I'm not going to say much more about this, but I would, if you are in the situation of doing team sort of clinical event debriefings, I would say good on you and have a look at this particular paper. So what I've tried to do is talk about the type of behaviors that promote team inclusiveness, specifically inclusive leadership, inclusive leader language, and team reflection, all of which seek to invite input, promote shared understanding, and promote speaking up behaviors. And the argument I've been trying to make is by improving these forms of communication and getting everyone on the same page, not only will we take better care of patients, but we will also promote our learning, both in simulation and in the workplace. In summary, team communication is vitally important to get the task work done that cares for patients. It enhances performance and also learning. Psychological safety promotes productive team interactions, so we must attend to that, as we've heard throughout this session today. There are tangible and observable behaviors that foster team inclusiveness. Again, inclusive leadership and inclusive leader language and team reflection. And I would hope that after this, that you'll think of concrete ways of integrating these principles of team inclusiveness into your simulation training. Here's the handout. As I put my camera on and take your questions, I'll leave this slide up. All you need to do is aim your smartphone camera at your computer screen, and you will download the PDF with all of the key references there for your own reading, because I know this is a very short time, and I know I didn't give you every detail required, but you can pull the papers that are of interest to you and hopefully integrate some of these ideas into your educational practice. So thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Great, thank you, Walter, and thank you. That's great for the handouts as well. That was really interesting talk. I have one question.
Please.
So a friend of mine, Tom Reeder, who is an organizational psychologist in the London School of Economics, he published a paper with some of his colleagues where they looked at transcripts from airplanes that had crashed, so big crashes, and they looked at they were interested in speaking up. And what they found was, so in aviation, there's lots of teaching around everybody needs to speak up, everybody needs to speak up. But actually they found from analyzing these transcripts, the issue wasn't so much with speaking up, the issues were around safety listening. So when they looked at the transcripts, people were speaking up, it's just that they weren't being listened to. So I guess I have two questions, which is, do you think we would see similar things if we could somehow get those kind of transcripts when something major goes wrong in healthcare? And how do we encourage the safety listening, and what should we do about that?
Well, I think that's a great question. I would only be speculating about what it would look like in healthcare. Although one of the whole arguments I'm making is that we as leaders need to be listening better. And that's what team inclusiveness is about. It's inclusive leadership is about creating a space for people to give voice to things. And, you know, it's interesting. I think engaging in inclusive leadership is about being ready for the suggestion. What do you think? What could we be missing? And it's creating a space for the speaking up in a way that's also signaling the receptivity. And so the pitfall you're describing, and I'm not familiar with Tom's work there, is that people are speaking up, but it's not being heard, which is a very different, slightly different notion. So I'm all for it. So I think we need to be speaking up, but also listening up. I couldn't agree more.
And do you think there's cultural differences, maybe between countries, but even between teams or between, so you have the in-group and out-group. Do you think is there a one-size-fits-all, or do you think things have to be tailored towards maybe not even just particular teams, but even our particular specialties, but even particular teams within those specialties? What do you think about that?
Well, as an educationalist, I would say context matters in a huge way. I mean, in a lot of my own educational research work, I really embrace a sociocultural perspective on learning. And I know Peter Cantillon is on, and Peter also has a sort of sociocultural perspective on learning, which really speaks to this idea of a community of practice, so to speak. And Renee Stahlmeyer's paper, The Wolf You Feed, really is about not only communities of practice, but landscapes of practice and how you negotiate the boundaries. And this is a long way of saying, yes, context matters. And I think people within a hospital form lots of different communities. And how do you cross the boundaries? And there could be very specific local cultures that you need to negotiate. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. Absolutely not. And these ideas of inclusive leadership may come from have a Western perspective, and we need more study to see how effective they are. The study that I was highlighting with the simulated scenarios was one we did in a German context, so we know that it works there. But I think context matters, and local culture matters.